This question came in from a viewer called Kartik, who wanted to know how to read the properties of some files using Excel VBA. Now, we do already have a video which explains how to read some basic file properties such as the name and the size using the Microsoft Scripting Runtime Object Library. But here Kartik's working with movie files, and he's interested in some of the more specific attributes such as the movie genre and release date. So in this video we're going to look at how to use a Windows shell object to get those extra attributes. I'm not actually going to work with movies myself in this video. I'm going to use some photos stored in a separate folder, mainly to give me the opportunity to show you some photos of some very good boys indeed. Feel free to work with whichever files you happen to have to hand. I'm not going to provide you with the files for this video, just use whatever you've got. I've got started by adding a brand new blank Excel workbook saved as a macro-enabled file, and in the Visual Basic editor I've inserted a new module. Just to help me with the IntelliSense so I get prompted with some methods and properties, and I don't have to guess everything, I'm going to set a reference to the Microsoft Shell Controls and Automation library. So from the Tools menu, I'm going to choose References and then scroll through the list to find Microsoft Shell Controls and Automation. I can then check that box and click OK. Then we can create a new subroutine. Let's call it something like Get File Properties, or Attributes if you prefer. And I'll attempt to spell that even vaguely correctly, and then we're ready to go. Let's start by writing the basic code that we need to process the collection of files in that Photos folder. So I'll start by declaring a variable which is going to hold a reference to an instance of the shell class. So I'll say dim sh as shell32.shell. Then I can declare a variable which is going to hold a reference to my folder object, so I'll call this one fol as a shell32.folder. And then a variable called fil, which will represent each individual file in that folder as a shell32.folder item. I can then create a new instance of the shell class by saying set sh equals new shell32.shell. And then I can use a method of that shell object to get a reference to the folder that I'm interested in. So I can say set fol equals sh dot, and then use the namespace method, and then in some parentheses and some double quotes, write in the path to the folder that I want to get. So it's c:\photos. Close the double quotes and close the round brackets. Finally, we can write a simple for each loop to process the folder items. So I can say for each fil in fol.items, and then say next fil, and then inside that loop let's just do something simple like, let's say debug.print fil.name, for example. So we get the very basic name property. If we then execute that subroutine or run it by pressing F5 or clicking the green triangle button, it will give us a list of the files it's found in that folder printed to the immediate window. Next, I'd like to get some extra information about the file, and to do that we're going to use the GetDetailsOf method of a folder object. I'll drop a link in the video description to the page on the Microsoft documentation site of the folder.getDetailsOf method, but the basic idea is that we pass in a reference to a file item and then a number which indicates the piece of information we want to return. And there are some suggestions here in the parameters section of using numbers between 0 and 4 to get some basic file information. So just to show the absolute basics of this method in action, let's head back to the Visual Basic editor, and in my debug.print statement, rather than saying file.name or fil.name, we're going to say fol.getDetailsOf, and then in some round brackets we can refer to the file that we're currently looking at, and then we're going to start with item number 0. And then just to see more than just the file name again, let's add a comma with a copy-pasted version of that same method, and then we can look for item number 1 or value number 1, and then value number 2 as well. And that should be sufficient just to demonstrate the principle. So if I clear the contents of the immediate window and then run that subroutine again, we'll see we get 3 pieces of information this time using the GetDetailsOf method. Now the documentation for the GetDetailsOf method is a little misleading, because it indicates that you can enter values up to a number of 4 for the second parameter to get these basic bits of information. But from a quick bit of basic testing before recording the video, I found I could enter numbers up to 320 and still return relevant values or properties of a file object. Just to give you an idea of what some of these extra attributes or properties might be, try heading into a Windows Explorer window. So I'll go back to my photos of dogs and then I'll head to a details view so I can see some of these column headings listed across the top. If I then right click on one of those column headings and choose more, you'll see the dialog box that appears provides you with a huge list of different properties you could display for different files. Now, of course, not every single property is going to be relevant for every single type of file. So things like video compression, of course, will only be relevant to video files. Things like 35mm focal length will only be useful for photos taken on a certain type of camera. So if we just wanted to list out every single property for the file, what we could do is loop through the numbers from 0 to 320 and write each individual property out. So to do that, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. Ultimately, we're going to want to write these values out onto a worksheet, I think, rather than into the immediate window. So what I'm going to do here is take the opportunity to declare a couple of variables for working with rows and columns numerically. So I'm going to declare a variable called r as long and c as long on the same line there. So we'll use those for the row number and the column number. So just wrapped around my debug.print statement, what I'm going to do is say for c equals 0 to 320. That's the maximum number that actually printed anything useful in my testing earlier. Feel free to bump that number up. The number may have increased since the video was recorded. We'll look at how we can get the information about what the name of each property is shortly. Then I'm going to add a blank line and then just below my debug.print statement say next c. And then rather than debug.printing this specific number, we're going to debug.print the value of the c variable. I'm then going to get rid of everything to the end of that line. And then we can clear the contents of the immediate window and then run the subroutine again. Of course, it'll take a little bit longer. And you can see there are lots of empty rows being printed here, of course, because not every property is relevant for a photo file, but you can see lots of extra bits of information have been written out, lots of photo information there in the immediate window. Now let's write these values out into a worksheet. I'm just going to use the existing Sheet 1 object for this, and to make sure I've cleared the content of that worksheet each time I begin the subroutine, I'm just going to start after my list of variable declarations by saying sheet1.cells.clear. Then inside the loop, each time I encounter a new file, I'd like to increment the value of my r variable to indicate that I want to move on to a new row. So I'm going to say r equals r plus 1. And then rather than debug.printing something, we're going to assign a value to a cell. So I'm going to remove debug.print and say sheet1.cells, open some parentheses, I'll use my r variable for the row number, and my c variable plus 1 for the column number. Plus 1 because c is beginning at 0 and there isn't a 0 numbered column in the worksheet, of course. Then I want to assign the value property, or change the value of the value property, by assigning the results of the GetDetailsOf method. Okay, so having done that, we can just quickly check we don't have anything on sheet 1 yet, but if we run the subroutine again, once it has finished, shouldn't take too long. When we look back at the worksheet, we've got lots of information about the various files in that folder, and that goes all the way along, quite a long way. Not quite sure how much useful photo information there is. Well, there we go. There's a big jump and then some extra information about the photos. Finally, it would just be useful to have the column headings listed in the first row of the worksheet. So to add those in, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And the simplest way I can think of to do this is to start by just copying and pasting the for next loop nested inside the for each loop, so the one which counts from the numbers 0 to 320. So I'm going to copy that loop and then I'm going to place it just above the for each loop. I'll just change my indenting to get everything to line up neatly. Then what we're going to do is change the value of a cell, not to try to get the details of a particular file, but to get the details of null. So if we change a reference to the file variable to the value of null, then that will read in the column heading rather than the value of that attribute for any particular file. All I need to do now is make sure that I'm beginning on row number 1, because at the moment the R variable will be set to 0. So just before I begin that loop, I'm going to say R equals 1. So we'll loop through the number 0 to 320, writing out the column names first, and then loop through the files in the folder. For each file, looping through the attributes of 0 to 320 and writing those values into the worksheet. So the end result should be, if I've cleared the contents of sheet 1, which I'm doing in this subroutine already, if we just run that subroutine, again it'll take a little while to run. But when it's finished, we'll have the column headings listed in the worksheet as well, so we can then see every single property of the cell all the way up to the 321st, whatever that happens to be. So there we go. Now of course you'll get different properties written out for different types of files. So here I've got nothing to do with musical files, no artists or album or year, etc. But if we just changed the folder we were looking at, so let's say I headed back to the Visual Basic editor and I changed photos to say music instead. I've got a few MP3 files stored in a folder. So if I run that subroutine again, it's going to loop through a different range of files. I think there are 10 or 11 of them in that folder. And when that one's finished, we should be able to just go back to the Excel workbook and see that we've got lots of information about authors and albums, etc., that we didn't see, of course, for the photos. So there you go. There's the basics of getting all of the file attributes or file properties using a shell object. Hopefully that was enough to answer the original question. I think it probably was. But as always, if you think of more questions, feel free to ask them, and I'll do my best to keep up with some answers. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you next time.